The marriage of Adele was another matter that was much on my mind at this time. I was as difficult to please in making my choice of a husband for her as I had been in selecting one for myself. No one seemed to measure up to my standards. It was agreed that she should join me in Holland, where I hoped to find a man worthy of her. I must do my husband the justice of saying that in spite of his usual suspiciousness of all the women, he never dared suspect the character of Adele. Her gentle nature, her well-balanced mind obliged him, as they did everyone else, to submit to her charm and at the same time to admire her. For a long while he sought to make her act as judge of our domestic difficulties. He explained to her his grievances and attempted to justify his conduct. Not being able to convince her that he was in the right, he finally ceased to honor her with his confidence. When I said goodbye to Adele, the hope of seeing one another in the near future assuaged our grief. Saint-Lô had been fixed as the point from which we were to start our journey. My husband and all my household were already there. I came back late one day from Saint-Cloud, where I had with so much difficulty said farewell to my mother, and I stopped at Paris to make final arrangements. The courtyard of my house was full of baggage carts and people. The first part of our baggage train was about to leave. All this bustle and the sight of horses which were to take me away from home were painful to me. 2 days more, and I in turn should be saying adieu to France. Finally, the cart started, and complete silence took the place of the earlier confusion. At that moment, the only servant remaining in the house informed me that a visitor was asking for me who wished to speak to me in private. It was Monsieur de Flau. The fact that it was impossible for him to enter my house under normal conditions had not prevented him from casting aside all prudence in his desire to bid me goodbye. For the first time since I knew that he was dear to me, I found myself alone with him. Alarm and emotion held me spellbound. As he stepped near to me, I uttered a cry. "Remember," he said, "people may come in and you would be compromised." I replied, "I do not care what people think about me as long as I do not do any harm." Then, with utmost simplicity, I confessed my love for him. At the same time, however, I declared that dear as he was to me, virtue was still dearer, since it was virtue alone which sustained me in the midst of my husband's hideous suspicions, that it was my only true consolation, and without it I could not survive. I told him I wished him every happiness. I assured him he would always have my friendship. I left him in a condition that cannot be expressed with words. I was proud of having such control over him, and the consoling thought came to me in the midst of the tears evoked by so sad a parting, that at last the man whose admiration meant so much to me knew what was in my heart. Yet how much dearer a person becomes when he has seen us to our best advantage, when he has been able to appreciate our qualities, especially if others are blind to them and accuse us unjustly. My husband, my children, and I finally left Saint-Lô on the evening of June 15th, 1806. My eldest son slept all night on my knees, the other boy on those of his governess. My husband and I, absorbed in our own thoughts and without saying a word to each other, probably both suffered from the fact that we were unable to share our common grief or seek consolation from the person whom sacred ties should have rendered dear to us. Each looked upon destiny as his only friend. I shall not describe our journey in detail. The martial escorts, the honors, receptions, and speeches only wearied me. I wrote my mother from the Chateau of Laeken near Brussels, and I wrote the emperor from Antwerp, asking him to pardon a prisoner who had been sentenced. Now came the most painful moment of all, that instant when I was obliged to leave our French escort, and when I caught sight of the Dutch authorities waiting for us on the other side of the frontier. Change one's nationality, become something else than French. Sorrowfully, I cast my eyes back to the land where I had been born. Should I ever see it again? Should I ever again meet my friends? Should they not forget me? At that moment, I felt as though I were doomed to remain forever a stranger, both to those I now left behind me and to those who were about to adopt me. I found myself cut off from everything and everybody absolutely by a separation comparable with that which makes death so dreadful to us. My throbbing heart prevented my replying to the speech with which the Dutch authorities greeted me. My husband did so for both of us. However deep his own grief seemed, He knew how to reply to complimentary phrases and did so along the way. We stopped at the Palais du Bois near The Hague and made our entry there a few days later. I have always been so anxious to reassure and place at their ease those whom my presence might intimidate that the art of receiving guests and visitors came to me naturally. For instance, at a reception where 400 women were presented to me, I found something to say to each one. One day, Admiral Verhuell appeared to me to be much embarrassed. He had assumed the reins of office during the time between our appointment and our arrival, and in accordance with the English custom, which was followed in Holland for the Prince and Princess of Orange, he had placed my name beside that of the King in the public prayers. The first act of my husband was to remove the name of the Queen. The Admiral pointed out the bad impression this would make, especially as the custom had been in force for a month. He even came to tell me about it, thinking that I would protest. But what was there to be done? I could not help feeling hurt at this discourtesy on the part of my husband, although I should have been so accustomed to it as to not notice it any longer. Another time, the general commanding the Royal Guard came to ask me to tie the new ribbons to the regimental colors. I wrote to Paris for ribbons embroidered like those which my mother had distributed to the Imperial Guard, but with my name instead of hers on them. When my husband saw the ribbons, he had them taken off, saying that my name was ridiculously prominent and that it looked as though it were I who had presented the flags. Such annoying incidents occurred so frequently that I sought to efface myself more and more. I limited my activities to my maternal duties and to my customary occupations, such as painting, writing songs, and taking history lessons from the Abbé Bertrand. Much to my astonishment, the king, who was organizing his official household, filled the most important posts with Frenchmen chosen from among those who had followed him to Holland. None of them expected as much. They had thought they would only spend 3 months each year at our court on special missions from France. They were delighted. The Dutch very properly protested against this proceeding, and misunderstandings between the two parties arose. Monsieur de Senegras, whom the emperor had never been willing to receive, obtained the most prominent position, that of general inspector and head of the Navy Department. Everyone had cause to complain against his spying and his frequent lack of manners. Although my husband had not spoken to me for some time, one day we had a long conversation. He first sent me a letter reviewing the entire history of our married life. His affection for me, his regrets, and my coldness toward him were all described in detail. Later, he came in person to beg for a reconciliation. "Stop," I said. "I no longer consent to such a thing. My sorrows have been too great. I have been spared nothing, neither your unjust suspicions nor your scandalous investigations into my conduct. I have forgiven you, but so much pain has inevitably altered my feelings toward you. Change your conduct, and my sentiments towards you will change also. I shall not try to give you a false impression, but you must make me forget the past. Make me care for you again, and this requires time. It cannot be done at once." He became angry, shed a few tears, and told me that he did not believe in woman's virtue, that I had been unhappy and had certainly sought to console myself. "True," I replied, "and I had one consolation at least, of which you could not deprive me, the knowledge I did not deserve the treatment you inflicted on me." My husband left me without having uttered a word of affection or of regret. Our entry into Rotterdam was remarkable for the enthusiasm of the spectators. It is the same thing everywhere. People love a change and expect what is new will be an improvement. My only sensation was one of fear when I felt myself carried along by a mob that seemed to have gone mad. In spite of our efforts, we had not been able to prevent the crowd from unharnessing our horses and drawing our carriages along by hand. This explosive joy, so similar to furious rage, froze me with terror. My nerves were too weak to bear the sight, and every moment I imagined someone was being crushed beneath our wheels. "Alas," I said to my husband as I remembered tales I had heard from Madame Campan, "these are receptions such as were held in France to celebrate the arrival of Marie Antoinette." Later, the mob sacrificed her with equal enthusiasm. It was not the moment to indulge in such painful memories. My state of mind affected everything I saw. Nevertheless, I witnessed one spectacle that was truly an imposing one: the launching of a magnificent man-o'-war. This is a ceremony so impressive that it appeals strongly to the imagination. We did not remain long in Holland, but went on to Wiesbaden, where the king wished to take the waters on account of his health. We lived in the palace of Mayence. The Grand Duchess of Darmstadt, as well as many foreign princes and those belonging to the House of Nassau, came to see us. The latter gave us a charming entertainment at the palace. Prince Charles of Nassau told me one day that he had heard how popular I was already in Holland, a country which had been greatly attached to the family of the Prince of Orange. People knew I was related to this family, and he himself gloried in that fact. I considered the compliment rather exaggerated. I knew there'd been a marriage between my family and that of Bavaria and Nassau, but it had occurred so long ago it was not to be taken seriously. Indeed, it struck me as highly probable that it was the crown I now wore which caused people to recall this relationship. I had never paid any attention to it, and it was merely by chance that I knew of it and understood the prince's compliment. On the other hand, I never had any reason to feel hostile to his family and would gladly have exchanged my royal rank for a little of their peace of mind. Everywhere I went, something disagreeable or unpleasant happened. When I passed through Nijmegen with my husband, I was so ill I could not continue my journey. The king went on alone, and I followed 2 days later. I did not know my new courier any better than I knew the other members of our household. Catching sight of him running beside the carriage with tears streaming down his cheeks, I asked the reason. It seems he had just lost the purse which had been given him to pay the post horses, and expected that the equerry in charge would oblige him to meet the loss out of his own pocket. The sum was about 1,000 francs. I told him not to worry, that I would give him the money. I did so on our arrival and forgot all about the matter. This man was sent back to Paris. I gave him no letter to take back, but Madame de Villeneuve and Madame Cochelet gave him some notes for their family. On his return, my husband's secretary, acting on his master's orders, had the courier searched and demanded the letters he was thought to be bringing me concealed about his person. The gift of the 1,000 francs had become known. I was supposed to have bribed the messenger. In spite of all the threats, he was unable to hand over what he did not have in his possession. It is easy to imagine how deeply my feelings were hurt when the courier told me of the treatment he had undergone, at the same time offering me his services and assuring me of his devotion. I had been reduced to this. A servant believed he could be of service to me, and even his own devotion was an insult. I fancy, however, that my torments cannot have been as great as those of my husband. His restless nature did not give him an instant's peace. Our apartments were some distance apart. Frequently I heard him in the drawing room, when everyone else had retired, steal up and listen outside my door. One evening, one of my ladies-in-waiting with whom I was chatting while getting undressed came near having to spend the night in my room. For the next morning, my chambermaid and I discovered that we had been locked in. Generally, we laughed about so many strange occurrences, but they injured my reputation to such an extent that I felt them deeply. My husband, leaving the waters of Wiesbaden, went to Aix-la-Chapelle, where I followed him 2 days later. Adele had joined me at Mayence. I set all my carriages and the officers of my household to wait for me at Cologne, and embarked on the Rhine aboard the handsome yacht belonging to the Prince of Nassau. Monsieur Aguet, who had come there in order to bring his daughter to me, was the only man who accompanied me while we were on the water. The weather was fine, the scenery delightful. We spent our time admiring the different landmarks which passed before our eyes. These rocks, these towered keeps, recalled the age of chivalry. The sight of them transported me back to the past, away from the age we live in, which always seems the least attractive. My eldest son played near at hand while I sang ballads and accompanied myself on my guitar. I also composed some ballads myself, inspired by the beauties of the landscape. Many pilgrims, such as I had never seen before, followed us reciting psalms, and from the neighboring shores the villagers put out in boats to bring fruit and flowers. In the evening we anchored and fell asleep, each in a little cabin, soothed by the sound of a serenade from some villager nearby. This calm after so much agitation, this freedom after so much constraint, combined to make these 3 days of sailing 3 of the happiest in my life. When we arrived at Cologne, I saw the entire population waiting for me on the shore. What an abrupt contrast! The calm solitude had delighted me. The sight of this crowd revived the memory of my rank and the sense of my duties. I wished to preserve as long as possible the memories of the days just past. I stepped on shore before reaching the official landing stage, and on foot, leading my son by the hand, I sought to discover the nearest inn, but I was quickly surrounded by a numerous escort commanded by General Dupont. There was nothing to be done. I admitted to the general that he had outmaneuvered me, and I climbed into the great stagecoach, big enough for 6 people, which had doubtless belonged to the former elector. I was obliged to pass through the city at a snail's pace in the midst of a curious crowd, and in the evening attend a ball given for me by the Grand Duke of Berg, who was staying at Dusseldorf. His wife, Princess Caroline, had stayed in Paris, dissatisfied with her husband's appointment as Grand Duke of Berg and Cleves, talking about Murat, which she considered less than his and her desert. She never would consent to go there. On leaving France, I thought I had said a last farewell to all those whom I cared for. Fate ruled otherwise. Monsieur de Flahault passed through Aix-la-Chapelle while we were still there. He accompanied the Grand Duke of Berg when the latter called to say goodbye before joining the army which was marching on Prussia. Nothing is more painful than the sight of a man who is dear to you, leaving to expose his life. How sad it is not to be able to say a word of farewell, to be obliged to stifle in one's bosoms all one's prayers and fears. When he left Holland, my husband was obliged to take command of the army that was marching towards Wesel, as a raid by the English forces was feared owing to the country's having been stripped of troops. It was decided my children and I should go and live with my mother, who had accompanied the emperor to Mayence, and was to remain there for the duration of the war. The Prince of Baden also came there from Mannheim, where she was living. We witnessed the arrival of all those young ladies who considered us their natural protectresses, and who were anxious to have news of their husbands. Our time was spent in waiting for messengers from the front and praying for the success of our army. The day of my arrival, I heard of the combat at Saalfeld, where Prince Louis of Prussia was killed. I had often heard him well spoken of, and his death affected me as much as though I had known him personally. The Battle of Jena dealt Prussia a mortal blow from which she seemed unlikely to recover. The emperor had accustomed us so thoroughly to the idea of victory that the possibilities of a defeat never entered our minds. Our only anxiety was for the lives of the combatants. Our only alarm was the thought of the dangers to which they were exposed. A battle which seemed decisive aroused our enthusiasm because it made us anticipate a speedy end to the conflict. This, however, was still in the distant future. Every day, thousands of prisoners passed through Mayence and marched by under the windows of my house, which was situated opposite the bridge. I frequently gave them money. They were unfortunate, therefore I considered them as no different from Frenchmen.